Holly Hanson, who is the coordinator of the research department of the Baha'i World Centre and is also a Professor Emeritus of History at Mount Holyoke College. She's written numerous books on social and economic development, community building, and power, with a particular focus on Uganda. And her talk today on moral economy, governance, and how we place ourselves in time grows out of her most recent book, To Speak and Be Heard, Seeing Good Government in Uganda 1500 to 2015, which was published by Ohio University Press in 2021. So thank you so much, Holly, for joining us from the World Centre, and I'll pass over to you now.
I want to thank the ABS committee for planning this really fascinating program, which is one thing that I think it does is it allows us to appreciate what it was that a National Spiritual Assembly was created 100 years ago, and then what that institution has done and the distance that has been traveled over this 100 years. Something that I have been struck by listening to the presentations over the day is how they fit together in really interesting ways. So we've seen just now where the Baha'i community has come in the last, where the National Spiritual Assembly of the UK has come in the past 30 years. And we heard from Rob about an earlier point in the British Baha'i community's history. But from Alex, we heard about Baha'i institutions as we imagine they will be in the future. And Max Afnan took us further back to the ideas that surround the birth of institutions that we live inside of in the present. What I want to do in relation to that is to talk about the institution of the market, because markets are a profoundly important institution. But I think in telling you the two stories that I'm going to tell about the nature of markets, I think we can see something. We can see something about about our assumptions about institutions and governance. And I'll come back to that. But before I tell this story of moral economy, which is the story of two markets, and draw a line from there to institutions and governance, I just need to follow Wendy by asking a question about the history that she just told us. And that is, what is the time frame in which we see the fulfillment of the story of the maturation of the National Spiritual Assembly that she told? Or to put that question another way, what links can we draw between the National Spiritual Assembly 100 years old and like the big story of the history of religion? Because we have seen over the course of today these stories of this one institution growing and people understanding more and understanding more. And I think we experience that story and we look towards the future, which makes sense. But I think another way to understand it is to say, here we are, a 200-year-old religion, and in 200 years after Christ, or 200 years after Muhammad, what kinds of similarities are there in what we're doing now and we're trying to figure out, and what they were trying to do and trying to figure out? And I think if we put ourselves in time, if the Baha'i community puts itself in time, in the time of the arc of the growth of religions, then I think it adds depth to the story that Wendy just told us. Okay, but let me go from there. That was the end of my talk, back to the beginning of my talk, and tell you about two different kinds of markets. So earlier today, or at the beginning of the day, Maya spoke about a values context in which international institutions are trying to figure out solutions to problems, and evoked the need for values in doing that. And then Max took us further back in time, and he talked about the idea, sort of the analogy of a contract to how people understand society. And I actually want to go to that point in time, particularly the 18th century, and the challenge that was being faced in England in relation to production of food. So across the 18th century in the British Isles, there were periodic food, what people remember as food riots. The price of food would fluctuate, it would go up, there would be dearth of some kind, like a drought in some area or something. There would be a lack of food, prices would go up, and then what people remember, or what historians thought until the early 1970s, was there would be food riots. And then E.P. Thompson, a social historian, wrote what was the most influential history essay of the 20th century, the most cited essay, the most read one, was called The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th century. And the reason I'm going to talk about the moral economy of the English crowd in the 18th century, and then I'm going to talk about a chapter of my book and an article that came out of it called The Moral Economy of the Ugandan Crowd in 1945. And obviously, I wrote my essay on the moral economy of the Ugandan crowd speaking to E.P. Thompson, but I want to use the Ugandans of 1945 and these insistent British citizens of basically across the 18th century to think about the market, and also to try to understand that like the relationship between something bigger than institutions and institutions. So that's where I'm going. So in the 18th century, when there was a dearth of food and people got upset about it and tried to get food, there are a couple things that E.P. Thompson wanted people to notice. He basically said what was going on was certainly noisy and visible, but he said we can't call them riots. That the crowd that people working was that the crowds that gathered were organized, disciplined, and they acted on the expectation that other people would listen to them. They had an expectation of a social whole. And then I want to tell you a story about 1945, where there was a dearth of, it wasn't a dearth of food, it was a high rate of inflation caused by World War II. And people acted, it's remembered as a riot, but people acted in an organized way. They were disciplined. They understood themselves to be part of a social whole. And they argued that people should listen to them. They acted with an expectation that people would see they were part of a social whole. So the social body analogy, which Max referred to earlier today as something that we envision coming in the future, my talk relates to Max's in that I think that understanding of a social whole has existed in societies in the past. Okay, so let me tell you a few stories about the 18th century in England, and then I'll tell you a few stories about the 20th century, the mid 20th century in Uganda. So although the process of the marketing of food was changing at this time in England, people had an expectation that the rules that had existed would still continue to exist. And those rules, they were recorded, they had been recorded a few hundred years before that. Those rules set up the marketing of food so that everyone would be able to buy food, even poor people. So for example, farmers had to sell their crops in the marketplace. You couldn't sell your crop in the field. You couldn't bring a sample of your crop and show it to middlemen from London who would say that looks like the kind of grain I want to buy. I'll buy your whole crop standing in the field. That was completely illegal. The farmer had to harvest the crop and then bring it to what was called a pitching market, which means he would harvest everything, bring it into the market, and it was all supposed to be there in the market and get sold in the market. And when the market day started, a bell would ring. The first bell would ring. You couldn't sell anything before the first bell rang. The first bell would ring. Then poor people anybody could go into the market and buy any small amount of produce that they wanted. So if I came in and I wanted to buy a handful of grain, the farmer had to sell me a handful of grain. Then an hour later, another bell was rung. And after that, people could sell larger amounts of produce. So rules like that it was a market, but rules like that set up the structure of the market so that people of different amounts of wealth could participate in it. And part of what E.P. Thompson shows in his analysis of these food disturbances was that the so-called rioters didn't break into someone's storehouse and steal all the cheeses. They would ask to buy them at a certain price. If they couldn't get it at the price that they thought was the price that food should cost, they would break in, take the food out, sell it at the just price, and then give the proceeds from their sale to the person whose storehouse they'd broken into. So he makes the point with like lots and lots and lots of evidence that the food riots were people saying, it's not fair for you to increase prices when there's not a lot of food. You have to sell food at the just price. And to prove that to you, we'll just take this food, we'll sell it at the just price, and then we'll give you the money that you should have earned. So what's interesting about this is what we see is a market, but a kind of conflict among people in 18th century England about what the rules of the market should be. So would the rule be supply and demand, or would the rule be in a market you have to behave in a way that shows you recognize your reciprocity, you recognize you're connected to all the other people here. I think that's what I want to say about 18th century British food markets. But just to emphasize the point that E.P. Thompson wanted to show that the so-called rioters were communicating with each other, were acting in a quite disciplined way. He describes people taking grain, what they called corn, taking corn in sacks, taking it out and selling it, then returning the sacks as well as the money to the person whose sacks they had, quote, stolen. So he says, look at them. They were disciplined. They were organized. They were communicating. Lots of women, lots and lots and lots of women were leading these efforts. And they acted with the assumption of reciprocity, of society as a human body. Okay, now let's go to and part of what's interesting about the story is not everybody, that's how the crowd acted, but other people in society were making the assumption that the rules of the market should be supply and demand. And the tension came because the market was enlarging. So food from various regions of England was being sold to London instead of staying in the area where it had been grown. Okay, now let's talk about Uganda. Just as World War II ended, there were strikes around the world because of the inflation caused by the war. And in various parts of the world, the funds that went in, like the funds that went into Mombasa to build the port up so that the war effort could use the port, the money poured in, and then because of that, lots more money and the contraction of trade because of the difficulty of moving things during the war, prices went up. And in the context of that price inflation, ordinary people couldn't buy food. So there were strikes basically around the world, right as World War II ended, because of World War II inflation. And one of those places where there was what looks like a very large strike is in Uganda. And in 2019, I guess, 2018 or 2019, I was at the British National Archives reading the records of this Uganda strike, which had just been released through the story of the release of these records is really interesting, but I can't tell it because I'll run out of time. And as I read about it, there's a few things that I noticed. First of all, just as E.P. Thompson had noticed in the 18th century, what had been called a violent strike wasn't violent. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized what Ugandans were doing might have in ways looked like a strike, but the moral concepts that people were invoking and even the actions they were taking were not entirely the actions of a strike. So one of the things I discovered, I read in these records that hadn't been seen, was that every kind of worker met together. So the people who were the cleaners, people who cleaned the houses of colonial authorities, the cleaners met in an assembly in a public park under a tree and had a conversation about whether they should withdraw their labor. And they discussed it, that they decided they would find out what people in other towns were doing, and they collected money to send letters to the cleaners in other towns to find out what they were doing. The tailors decided that given the inflation, they would increase the price that they charged for making clothes, and they published a list of the prices that they would charge. The public works department, the telegraph office employees, all of these, the drivers, when the withdrawal of labor began, it was after workers of every kind had decided as groups that was what they were going to do, that they were going to pull their labor back. Why am I not calling, why did I see in it that makes me not want to call it a strike, but a labor action of withdrawing labor? In Eastern Africa, the book that Malin referred to is about Uganda, but this pattern is true across East Africa. Over centuries, people understood their contribution to society and, in a way, their identity through the work that they offered to a chief, or the work that a chief and his people offered to a king. And groups of people would do that labor, or like bring the fruits of their labor, and not just bring it, but celebrate it. So in the late 19th century, when British imperial entrepreneurs are just showing up in Kampala. One of them thought that a war was beginning because he heard this tremendous shouting outside of where he lived. And he went outside, and what was going on was actually the people of a chief were bringing firewood to the palace of the king, but they weren't just like carrying the firewood up the road. They were dancing the firewood up the road and singing the firewood up the road and making a really big production of bringing the gift of the firewood so that everyone would see and appreciate the work they were doing. So I knew that from other, I mean, I had used that story in another book of Uganda history that I had written. And then as I'm reading about the so-called strike, I read that the people who had withdrawn their labor in the city of Jinja had a plan where on the first day, the people from the Public Works Department marched from the Public Works Department carrying their tools. And a different kind of worker danced from their place of work, dancing with their tools. And the employees of the tobacco factory came, I can't remember what the tobacco factory workers were doing, but each group of workers paraded into the center of town with a kind of action that showed what their labor was. They timed it so they all arrived in the center of Jinja at the same time. They had a big celebration, and then they went around the city to get other people to stop working. So it could be just, you know, their first day of their strike. But to me, it looks like an action that says, you have to see us. You have to see our labor. You have to see the value of our labor. And every day of this labor action in Kampala, all the people would meet on the top of a hill in Kampala and have a meeting in which they discussed what was going to happen. Were the colonial authorities going to listen to them? When could they have a meeting with the colonial authorities? And it's very clear that what they wanted, they wanted their wages to go up, but they wanted to be seen. They wanted justice. They wanted to be acknowledged, that they wanted their work to be acknowledged, and that they would be treated as the productive members of society that they were. I have a lot of evidence for that. Some of it is workers would go back to work when their employers would offer them just a teeny bit more money, not enough money to actually buy food in the situation of the inflation, just a little bit. The workers went back to work, and the labor organizers were really mad. There was a couple foreign labor advisors, and they were like, don't go back to work. But the Ugandans thought, our employers are showing us some respect by raising the wages, and so we have to show that we respect and love them by going back to work. I think I probably need to move on, but let me check to see if there's anything more I want to say about this. Oh, I want to tell you about, because one of the arguments that E.P. Thompson made that I want to draw a parallel is the discipline, the incredible discipline of these groups of people. And as I said earlier, it wasn't just one great big mass of thousands and thousands of people. It was units of people organized according to the work that they did, consulting with each other, then consulting in larger groups. And these groups that had consulted in small groups, joining together into a large group to get a sense of what they were doing for the day, then breaking again into smaller groups and moving around the urban areas. So in Uganda at this time, it was colonial Uganda, so the British were in charge, but in theory, underneath them were traditional kingdoms that had existed in Uganda for about 500 years before this. And it's very interesting looking at this to see that the people who the Ugandans withdrawing their labor most wanted to influence were the indigenous rulers beneath the British. They wanted the British to listen, but they wanted the king to hear what they had to say and then go work it out with the governor. So they're basically putting themselves in, they were putting themselves into a sequence of amounts of power, and the people above them were the king, and they expected the king to understand them. So in fact, indigenous government hadn't had one of the elements of indigenous government that was really critical to indigenous political accountability was that rulers had to listen. This is why the title of this book is To Speak and Be Heard, because to be heard is at the essence of political accountability. In fact, for pretty much all of the 20th century, that system had been undermined and really perverted by colonial rule. But even so, at this moment of crisis, people like they resurrected an indigenous institution, which was to gather in the courtyard of the king. So thousands of people show up in the morning and sit in the courtyard of the king, waiting to be heard. This is a longer story than I have time to tell, but there's a sort of like a back and forth with police coming out and then soldiers coming out, and the group just doesn't leave. And eventually in 1945, they sat quietly on the ground singing. The records say hymns, but probably it was the songs composed by the women leaders of the cooperative movement. They just sit, thousands of people, and eventually the king caves and people get what they wanted. 5 years later, there's another conflict, and by that time, because of what happened in 1945, gathering was illegal. So I really have to stop telling this story because it will take too long. Okay. Just let me say, people were really disciplined. They were meeting in small groups. They had an understanding of the world as a human body in their sense that we are connected to you and we expect you to respond to us. Okay, so what do we do with this? The topic, if we frame, if I think about institutions and governance, I think an important question to me is, how do we expect institutions to give us good government? Like what's the causal link between good institutions and good government? And to think about that, to think about why we understand or why we assume that good institutions will help us have good government, I think there's a way that our sort of, I really feel paralyzed in speaking about this after listening to Max this morning. But I sort of feel like we conceptualize institutions as the containers. They're containers that hold human beings, and the shape of a good institution is a good container of human beings, that the shape that it makes produces good government. But I wonder if these stories about the market show us that, in fact, like maybe the container isn't actually the institution. Maybe the container that shapes human beings, that then produces good government, is a set of beliefs. It's the set of ideas that people hold and their expectations of themselves, because both the British 18th century story and the Ugandan 1945 story, they're really stories about the expectations people have of themselves and the expectations they hold of each other. E.P. Thompson called that moral economy, and that idea, that formulation, that people expecting something of each other in the way that society is put together could be called a moral economy, is perhaps what stuck and made his essay the most quoted history essay of the 20th century. But if you read the sort of a review of literature about moral economy in the present, a lot of the question is, was moral economy the past, and now we're in the present and it's not a moral economy, it's a different kind of economy? Or can there be moral economy in the present or in the future? And I think that actually, I think Max's talk was a very good exploration of the idea that yes, there is a thing like the container. There is a binding force around human beings which shapes our understanding, that then creates institutions, and then we use those institutions as tools. But it's always a moral economy. There is a moral economy, and the moral economy can be the morals that we need to regard the world as human body, or the moral economy can be the moral economy that we are all individual agents out for number one. Either one is they're both moral economies. It's just a different set of morals. And if that's the case, if the foundation of good government is not the electoral, not the system of political power, and it's not the economic institutions, but rather a set of ideas that shapes human behavior, then maybe that helps us understand how we put the National Spiritual Assembly in time. Because in fact, the period of time that it's in isn't the number of decades after the Declaration of Baha'u'llah that the first National Spiritual Assembly was elected, or the 100 years between that election and now. It's a larger arc of the growth of a consensus or recognition of spiritual reality. And as that fiber of understanding takes shape in communities and societies, and then people live inside it, the way Baha'u'llah says we live inside the laws. We live inside the reality, which is the Kitabi Akdas, the revealed law of God. When people start to live inside that reality, that's what creates the possibility of good government. Okay, Malin, I hope I left time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. That was really wonderful and just such a fab way to end the day, because I think, at least for me, it really tied together some of the underlying questions, which I think have been sort of part of a lot of the other talks, and in fact, sort of I think that in my head, one of my questions that has been coming up again and again is sort of, what is that mechanism? Like, what is the mechanism by which we could actually achieve good government? And I think you went into it in a really eloquent and really insightful way. So thank you very much. Again, I'll leave a bit of mute time for people to write their questions into the chat. There's definitely time for us to have questions. So please don't be shy. If anybody has any, then please send them. Okay, one anonymous question has come in, which is a kind of a personal question for you, which is what research are you doing at the Baha'i World Centre, if you're able to talk about it?
So I'm in the research department, and the responsibilities of the research department are translation from original languages into English. And the research department produces the Baha'i Reference Library. And also we need to think about, so my analogy for the research department is that the revelation is an unimaginable storehouse of jewels, and somebody's got to keep the storehouse and sort it and understand it and put the things in order. And that's the research department.
Brilliant, thank you. If anybody else has a question, please speak now. Otherwise, I will go on to closing statements. I'll give it another half a minute. Oh, okay, 2 questions have come in a quick succession. Okay. Jonathan asks, the moral economy of the present seems to be quite efficient at producing goods and services. Therefore, changing the moral economy requires us to change its goals. What do you see as some other goals that we can aim for?
What are some of the goals of what?
And what are some other goals that we can aim for other than producing?
Yeah. So the economy that we have may be efficient at producing goods, but it really falls down at distributing goods. So one of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, which from a Baha'i perspective is a consequence of the energizing influence of the revelation itself. The consequence of the Industrial Revolution was that want should have been eliminated in the world, because it so massively increased human productivity that there was enough clothing and enough shelter and enough everything for there to never be any more want in the world. But if you look at graphs, and Alex actually referred to the statistics on this, if you look at graphs of inequality between nations and inside of nations, it just goes up, 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 up. So in Baha'u'llah's time, the wealth gap between the lowest quintile of the wealthiest nation and the wealthiest quintile of the poorest nation was 1 to 3. And now, I don't know about right now, but the last time I looked a couple of years ago, it was like 1 to 75. So I don't know if I buy that efficiency argument, because I think if our economy doesn't eliminate, if it actually produces inequality, I don't think it's efficient. So I guess what I would say is a moral economy in a moral economy, there cannot be want. And I think to get there, if we put ourselves in time, we want to like put ourselves in time probably most usefully in relation to the last peak of human social, the last high point of social order, which would have been the height of Islam. And then if we look at the nature of the economy and the nature of local economy at the height of Islam, I think what we see is much smaller units and much more autonomy of economic actors. And I don't think I don't think that has to be the past, and now we're in the present. And I don't think modernity implies massive, extremely large units of production. But that's another talk. I actually gave that talk for the ABS in the US, and I think it's on their Vimeo.
Brilliant. Maybe I can direct the question asker to the recording. Okay, we've now got several more questions, so I'm going to begin to ask you some of them. So Max, our previous speaker, asks, I just wanted to ask about one point that Holly raised, which I thought was very insightful. If I understood correctly, it was the idea that good governance isn't just a function of institutional design and what institutions do, but institutions themselves reflect deeper beliefs among people about who they are and how they relate to each other. It reminded me of Abdu'l-Baha's statement that the reality of man is his thought. My question is, do you have any thoughts on what causes these fundamental ideas to change? This is, of course, a very broad question, so perhaps a little unfair. But what, for example, led the members of the Ugandan movement in 1945 or the 18th century movement to act the way they did? Would you imagine something similar happening today? And if not, why not?
Yeah, for the Ugandans, I think they hadn't let go of an awareness. I think an awareness of a social whole is, it's true that Baha'u'llah talked about it and we're going to get there, but I don't think it never existed in the past. And I think to humanity's capacity to do it, we got to that point through the contributions of every manifestation of God. So the House of Justice asks Baha'is to place ourselves in time, to be aware of our view of history. And our view of history is not things were bad in the past and they're going to be great in the future. Our view of history is that humanity has the capacity to advance, and we do it, and then we lose it a bit. And then we do it, and then we lose it a bit. So what I think was going on with Ugandans, and Shoghi Effendi says, when he's talking about materialism, this is in Citadel of Faith, he says that that the problem with capitalism and also communism is that the focus on material things, that's not exactly his words, but what he says is it makes people forgetful of those things of the spirit on which alone a stable foundation for society can be built. So we have this history of forgetting, and that history of forgetting for us, I think, is several hundred years long. But Maya's question is, what allows people to learn? I think learning is really experiential. And in the world that we live in, it's so easy for us to experience human beings as naturally competitive because all kinds of institutions have been set up to make us competitive. Universities are competitive, the law is competitive, politics is competitive, realist international relations is competitive. And it, it really bothers me that that word is realist. Like, why isn't it pessimistic international relations, which will get us all killed, is this, and possibly useful international relations theory that will cause us all to live is this. But no, that's called idealist. Anyway, we need experiences. We need experiences of human beings taking care of each other to allow us to believe that human beings can take care of each other. That's probably why the family is the basic unit of society. But families, and then groups of families, and then slightly larger groups of families can create with each other those experiences. And also, it doesn't take too many sets of families to be able to have economic support, the forms of mutuality that have economic consequences, little ones. So I think that our avenue, like the horizon of action, is we have to create experiences that show people that reciprocity is real. And then we add to that the power of the manifestation of God saying it. But we can't just act from telling people this is what the manifestation of God said, because it needs to be experiential, and which is, like basically what I'm describing is community building.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. Okay. So this is an anonymous question. How does the law of Huruk tie into these moral economies for those of us who don't know?
How does what tie?
The law of Huruk.
Oh, yeah, that's such a fantastic question. So the law of hukuk operates inside the conscience of the individual and at the level of the world. So one of the things that I've made the argument that the idea of the world as a human body is not exclusively Baha'u'llah, that's part of like the moral fiber of human reality, and it's been there in other religions. But what's different is the challenge of the present and the future is to create forms of reciprocity and mutuality that allow us to be a dynamic world civilization. And I think Hukukullah is part of the instrumentality of that, because it's so individual. You can't even suggest to someone else. You cannot get inside of somebody's relationship with their own soul and find out what they're doing about Hukukullah. You can't. Nobody can. So it's totally internal, but the effects are the consequence of that wealth going to the trustees of Hukukullah. The effects of it touch the whole world. And of course, once there's that much wealth in one place, the consequence of Hukukullah will be that it will be able to balance out any ups and downs in world trade, because it'll be that amount of money. Don't ask me anything more about that, because I don't understand it.
Yeah, it gets a bit mathsy, doesn't it? That's great, thank you. I will maybe ask you one or two more questions. Actually, I think I'll just ask you this one question because I think it's a nice one to end on. What would you say to any young Baha'is who are choosing research path forward? So I suppose people who are going into academia is meant by the question, and who want to correlate that path with the Baha'i writings.
Yeah. That's a really hard question because, of course, I want to say study history, but let me not say that. I think that I guess I have two ways to answer this. One is that I think the institute is very simple and practical. The Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity does a really superb job of helping people create a framework to correlate thinking about the revelation with thinking about academy. So that's one answer. I think there are a few things that are written that are just so extremely useful. You can just go to those things. I think Dr. Arbab's essay in The Lab, the Temple, and the Market is a fabulous example of how to think deeply, but then write in a write for people who aren't inside your paradigm. For me, as a student, you know, as a PhD student, so I started my PhD after serving at the World Center in the Office of Social and Economic Development. And actually, as I was starting graduate school, I said to the people who were mentoring me, which was Dr. and Dr. Khan, Dr. Peter Khan and Dr. Janet Khan, I said, but you know, if I go to graduate school, I will, you know, like it might pollute my Baha'i thinking. And they said, what did they say? Basically, they said, no, you have to think in a way that you can communicate with other people, and you should not worry. You don't have to worry that the revelation is going to lose out to Marxist social science. Don't worry about it. But what I found that I needed to do, sort of to keep my voice and my own ability to think as a graduate student, was I needed to write for myself, because I couldn't. There were things in the American Academy. There were thoughts I had that I couldn't say in a graduate seminar, but I needed to be able to keep thinking them. So I would just write for myself, and I would have Foucault, and then I'd be like, Holly says this to Foucault, and I would just write it for myself, and then I would go write my paper that didn't have that in it. So I would say, find other people so you can hold on to your voice, but the generation of knowledge is a collective process, and that means we have to do it in the place of that collective process. And right now, that's not our place. Like, we are marginal, and so we've got to move over into the place where people are speaking and speak with them. Okay, sorry, that was long.
No, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. And what an absolutely brilliant note to end on. So thank you so much, Holly.